Was Dracula ever a real person? Or was he always just a vampire story? Welcome to today's episode. Because behind the famous vampire myth, there's actually a strange mix of history, politics, propaganda, and a very human fascination with fear. Most people picture Dracula as a pale, immortal creature who drinks blood and lives in a dark castle. But the name, Dracula, originally belonged to a real ruler. A man named Vlad, more precisely, Vlad III, often called Vlad the Impaler. He lived in the 15th century in a region called Wallachia, in what is now Romania. And his story sits right at the crossroads of empires, myths, and storytelling. As a child, was actually sent to the Ottoman court, not as a prisoner exactly, but as a kind of political hostage. His father, Vlad II, had made an agreement with the Ottoman Empire, and as a guarantee, 2 of his sons were sent to live under Ottoman supervision. Vlad and his brother Radu spent part of their youth around the Ottoman capital region, learning language, military culture, and court life. It's an interesting psychological moment to imagine. 2 brothers growing up in the same environment. One of them, Radu, would later remain loyal to the Ottomans. The other, Vlad, would eventually fight against them. Same starting point. Very different paths. Years later, Vlad became ruler of Wallachia, and this is where the stories become darker. He gained a reputation for using a brutal form of punishment called impalement. Victims were placed on sharpened stakes and left to die slowly. It's horrifying to imagine today, but historians often remind us that the medieval world was already violent. Public execution and extreme punishments existed across Europe and the Balkans. Vlad's reputation came not only from the method itself, but from how often he used it and how dramatically it was reported. One famous story claims that when the Ottoman army advanced into his territory in 1462, they discovered a field filled with impaled bodies. Some stories say 20,000. But here's where things get interesting. That number mainly appears in hostile pamphlets written by German merchants and rival groups who opposed Vlad politically. Ottoman chronicles mention seeing impaled victims along the road, but they don't confirm that exact number. So historians today tend to agree on a middle position. Yes, Vlad used impalement. Yes, large displays of victims likely existed. But the number 20,000 may have been exaggerated. In other words, the fear was real, but the storytelling amplified it. Which raises another fascinating question. Were these stories meant simply to describe reality? Or were they also part of psychological warfare? Vlad himself used fear as a weapon. One of the most dramatic episodes from this period is the so-called night attack of 1462. Facing a much larger Ottoman army led by Sultan Mehmed II, the same ruler who had conquered Constantinople, Vlad launched a night raid directly into the enemy camp. Imagine the scene. Darkness. Soldiers dressed in enemy clothing. Confusion spreading through the camp. According to the stories, Vlad's forces managed to penetrate deep into the camp, but they attacked the wrong tent. The Sultan survived. Eventually, Vlad withdrew, and the campaign continued. Still, the attempt itself reveals something about his strategy. If you cannot defeat a larger army head-on, you attack its center of command. It's a striking example of asymmetric warfare centuries before the term existed. But perhaps the strangest story about Vlad isn't about battle. It's about dinner. Some accounts claim he once sat down to eat a meal surrounded by impaled victims. It's an image that feels almost surreal. A ruler calmly eating while death stands around him. But historians today are cautious with that story. Most of the sources that describe it come from hostile pamphlets, essentially the medieval equivalent of viral propaganda. The goal may not have been accuracy, but shock. To paint Vlad as something more than a brutal ruler. to paint him as a monster. And here's where the final twist arrives. More than 400 years later, in 1897, an Irish writer named Bram Stoker wrote a novel called Dracula. He borrowed the name. But the vampire character itself, the immortal blood drinker, the shape-shifting creature of the night, came mostly from Eastern European folklore and Gothic imagination. Stoker himself never even visited the region. He built the story largely from books, maps, and second-hand accounts, which means the most famous vampire in the world was partly born from a London writing desk. A real ruler, a violent reputation, political propaganda, folklore about restless spirits, and a Victorian horror novel, all layered together until history and myth became almost impossible to separate. So when we hear the name Dracula today, what are we actually remembering? A medieval prince? A propaganda villain? Or a fictional vampire who slowly replaced the real man behind the name? Sometimes the scariest part of history isn't the events themselves. It's how stories about those events evolve and how the human mind keeps reshaping them, turning rulers into monsters and monsters into legends.